He snapped his fingers and said, "Play something, entertain us." The entire dining room turned their heads. A waitress, young, soft-spoken, invisible just moments before, was now standing under the chandelier, cornered by the arrogance of a millionaire and the weight of 100 silent stares. She didn't ask for this. She wasn't looking to prove anything. But when she sat at that piano, something changed. What started as a cruel setup became a moment no one would forget. The room fell silent, not out of politeness, but awe. Her fingers moved, and with each note, she shattered every assumption, every smirk, every ounce of condescension in the room. And when she finished, even the man who mocked her couldn't speak. This isn't just a story about music. It's about power, dignity, and the quiet strength of someone who refuses to be small. Stay with us, because what happens next will make you believe in second chances, hidden brilliance, and the kind of justice that doesn't need to raise its voice. If you're moved by stories like this, hit like, drop a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more real stories that restore your faith in humanity. It was a golden Friday evening in Charleston, South Carolina. The sun dipped low over the historic district, casting warm hues across cobblestone streets and gaslit lanterns. Inside the Marigold Room, a high-end bistro nestled between preserved antebellum buildings, the ambience whispered of southern charm and wealth. Crystal glasses chimed softly, silverware clinked against porcelain, and from the far corner of the restaurant, the faint notes of a jazz piano danced under the murmur of conversation. Among the waitstaff weaving smoothly between linen-draped tables was Camille Harris, a 26-year-old with a steady hand and a quiet fire in her eyes. She wore the standard black and white uniform, pressed shirt, waist apron, and comfortable sneakers that didn't betray the grace with which she moved. To the elite patrons dining on seared scallops and sipping $90 bottles of wine, Camille was just another face in service. A name on a receipt. But beneath the surface, she was carrying a story few would guess and even fewer would care to hear. Camille had been playing piano since she was 7. Her introduction to the keys came in the form of a battered upright piano gifted by a retired neighbor who had taught music in the local school district. It sat in the cramped living room of her childhood home in Columbia, where her single mother raised 3 kids on a nurse's salary and a fierce belief in dignity. Camille's mother never had time for lessons or frills, but she made sure that piano stayed in tune, even if it meant skipping her own needs. While other kids were outside riding bikes or watching cartoons, Camille taught herself to mimic melodies from the radio. Her fingers stumbled at first, then flowed, tracing the path from pop to classical, from jazz to soul. By the time she was a teenager, she was performing at community centers and church services, her music offering a window into emotions she could never put into words. But dreams don't pay rent, and scholarships were few and competitive. Despite her talent and the local accolades she'd earned, Camille's path into the professional music world stalled under the weight of student debt, family obligations, and life's cold pragmatism. Her younger brother needed braces. Her mom's car broke down. Camille put her ambitions on hold and moved to Charleston, seeking work and independence. The Marigold Room was not just a paycheck, it was a deliberate choice. Camille had heard about the baby grand piano tucked into the corner of the dining room, rarely touched except by the occasional hired musician on weekend brunches. Even if she couldn't play it, even if she was just clearing wine glasses next to it, the very presence of the instrument made her feel closer to something real. Something that belonged to her. Most nights, she didn't have time to think about music. Double shifts, tight schedules, and demanding customers kept her in constant motion. But there were moments. Small ones. Like during closing, when she brushed the dust off the keys with a cloth, or during early prep hours, when the restaurant was empty and silent, and she'd let her fingers linger over a few notes, just enough to remember who she really was. The staff knew. A few had caught her playing when the dining room was still dark. Sous Chef Marcus once told her she had gold in her fingers, but she just laughed it off and got back to work. She didn't need compliments. She needed tuition money and time. 2 things she hadn't seen in years. But there was another reason Camille rarely played for others, one she rarely spoke of, not even to Marcus or her closest coworkers. A few years back, before she moved to Charleston, Camille had been invited to perform at a private function in Columbia. A gala fundraiser for a local arts foundation. She wasn't on the official program, just a last-minute addition thanks to a family friend who believed in her talent. Camille arrived wearing her best dress, carrying only confidence and a worn sheet of music tucked under her arm. But the moment she walked through the ornate doors of that ballroom, the air shifted. The woman at the check-in table glanced up, paused, then asked flatly, "Are you with catering?" Camille blinked. "No, I'm actually here to perform." The woman looked her up and down, skepticism written across her face. "The entertainment was hired weeks ago." Camille explained again. "The name. The invitation. The contact person." Reluctantly, the woman let her in. But the tone was set. When she walked toward the piano, a man in a tuxedo intercepted her. "Sorry, sweetheart, the stage is for performers. Staff wait in the back." "I am the performer," she said, her voice trembling but firm. The man didn't apologize. He didn't even flinch. He just stepped aside with a condescending half-smile, as if allowing her to embarrass herself was an act of grace. Camille played anyway. But as she performed on an instrument she wasn't allowed to warm up on, to a crowd that hadn't asked for her, she saw it in their eyes. Discomfort. Doubt. Dismissal. Not because of her talent. Not because of any mistake. But because she was a young black woman in a space where people like her were expected to serve, not shine. After her final note, there was no applause. Just the scraping of silverware, the return of shallow conversation, and a waiter whispering, "That was beautiful," before disappearing into the kitchen. Camille left quietly that night. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just packed her music and walked home in silence. That experience changed her. It didn't kill her dream, but it taught her how the world sometimes sees color before it hears music. And ever since, she had been careful. Cautious. Unwilling to offer her gift unless she was absolutely sure it would be received without ridicule. Until now. That night, Camille's section was the front dining room near the piano, with 6 reserved tables. She scanned her station, mentally noting which guests were finishing up and which still had appetizers to go. Everything was calm. Predictable. The kind of evening that made the hours feel long but easy. Then the front door opened, and everything changed. A group stepped in well-dressed, loud in the way only the wealthy can afford to be. At the front was a man who didn't need an introduction. Brandon Locke, the 41-year-old real estate mogul known for turning historic properties into boutique hotels, walked in like he owned the building. In a way, he probably did. Rumor had it he was eyeing the Marigold Room's lease for expansion. Brandon's reputation had arrived before he did. He was the kind of man who made grand entrances, snapped his fingers for attention, and threw around 6-figure deals as if they were poker chips. He had charm, yes, but the kind that came wrapped in sarcasm and an appetite for dominance. Camille watched from the corner of her eye as the host led Brandon's party to one of her tables. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her apron, and grabbed her notepad. She'd dealt with difficult guests before. Celebrities. CEOs. Egotists in designer watches. She could handle this. But Brandon Locke didn't see Camille as a server. He saw something else. Or rather, someone to amuse himself with. As she approached the table to take their drink orders, he glanced up with a crooked smile and read her name tag out loud. "Camille, huh? That's a musician's name if I've ever heard one." She kept her smile polite. "Water for the table to start." He waved a dismissive hand. "Scotch." "Neat. The Balvenie, if you've got it." "Tell me, Camille, what do you really do when you're not running drinks?" She blinked. "Excuse me?" "You're not just a waitress," he said, gesturing vaguely. You've got the look. The mystery. You play music, don't you? The question caught her off guard. I play piano, she admitted quietly, unsure why she even answered. Brandon leaned back, pleased with himself. A pianist. Now we're talking. I think we'll need a performance later. Camille laughed softly, uncomfortable. I'm not on the schedule for that. Brandon raised an eyebrow. Maybe you should be. His entourage chuckled, more at his tone than the words. Camille took the rest of the orders, her expression unchanged. But inside, something shifted. That familiar tension, the one where pride and humility collided, tightened in her chest. She didn't like being made a joke. She didn't like being reduced to a party trick. But she wasn't going to cause a scene. Not yet. As she walked away, Brandon watched her go, a smug smile creeping across his face. He wasn't done with her. Not by a long shot. The rest of the evening unfolded like a tightly wound clock ticking towards something unseen. Camille kept her focus sharp, navigating between tables with the practiced grace of someone who'd learned to absorb tension like a sponge. She could feel Brandon Locke's gaze like a pinprick between her shoulder blades every time she passed by. His smirk lingered. His voice cut through the hum of polite dinner conversation like a discordant chord. By the time entrees were being plated, Brandon had already begun putting on his usual show. He recounted business deals in booming tones that made nearby diners flinch. He threw around terms like liquidate and portfolio diversification, as if he were reading from a Wall Street fan fiction. His companions, clearly used to orbiting around his ego, laughed on cue. Camille had seen this act before, though rarely so aggressively performed. Some people, he said loudly between sips of his second scotch, waste their whole lives chasing dreams with no ROI. Piano lessons? Art school? It's all vanity. You either build something real or you serve people who did. The jab wasn't even subtle. Camille, passing by with a tray of crab cakes for table 4, pretended not to hear him. But she did. Every word. Camille, Brandon called out suddenly, snapping his fingers. She turned back. Yes, sir. Tell me something, he said, drumming his fingers against his rocks glass. How does someone like you end up here instead of? I don't know, Carnegie Hall. There it was. The bait. Camille offered a neutral smile. Life takes you where it takes you. Brandon leaned forward. Come on, don't be modest. You've got that look in your eye, the tragic artist thing. What's your story? Couldn't cut it at Juilliard? A few of his guests snickered. One of the women shifted in her seat, clearly sensing the line was being crossed, but said nothing. Camille kept her voice steady. I work here. That's the story. Brandon nodded slowly, lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. Well, I think it's a shame to waste talent. We've got a piano in the room, don't we? He gestured dramatically toward the baby grand in the corner. I say we give the people a show. The nearby tables perked up at the commotion. A few heads turned. Others glanced toward the piano. Camille's stomach clenched. I'm not scheduled to play, she said, her voice tighter now. Brandon looked around theatrically. Scheduled? Who needs a schedule for art? Then to the room, ladies and gentlemen, we have a performer in our midst. Camille here is going to bless us with a little concert. Camille froze. It wasn't just the arrogance of the demand, it was the tone. The implication that this wasn't an invitation, but a command dressed as flattery. He wasn't asking her to perform. He was daring her to try and fail, just for the sport of it. I'm not comfortable with that, she said quietly. Brandon tilted his head. You scared? I thought artists loved attention. She said no. Marcus, the sous chef, said suddenly from the service window. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Brandon barely glanced in his direction. I'm just trying to encourage a little culture. Didn't realize this place had such a strict anti-music policy. The tension thickened. Camille stood rooted to the floor, heat rising in her cheeks. She could feel her coworkers watching from behind the counter. Diners now fully aware that something was happening. Something uncomfortable. And that's when Brandon said it. Maybe she's not as talented as she thinks. All talk, no music. It wasn't a shout. It didn't need to be. It landed like a slap. Camille's eyes flicked to the piano. Then to Brandon. Then to the room full of faces that had gone from politely disinterested to ravenously curious. She should walk away. That would be the smart thing to do. The mature thing. The professional thing. But she didn't. Because it wasn't just about pride anymore. It was about something deeper. Something older. Every moment she'd spent biting her tongue in school, in jobs, in interviews where her name and skin seemed to disqualify her before she even opened her mouth, it all came flooding back. Her mother's voice whispered in her mind, "Don't let them define your value, baby. You know who you are." So Camille did the opposite of what Brandon expected. "Fine," she said, her tone even, calm. Brandon blinked. "I'm sorry." "I'll play," she repeated, louder this time. The room hushed. Somewhere, a fork clinked against a plate and stopped. Marcus stepped around the prep line, locking eyes with her as if to silently ask, "Are you sure?" Camille nodded, more to herself than anyone else. She walked toward the baby grand. The path felt long. Her sneakers barely made a sound on the polished hardwood floor, but her pulse roared in her ears. The lights above the piano caught the sheen of sweat beginning to form at her brow. She sat down. The bench creaked as she adjusted her posture. She didn't look back at Brandon. She didn't need to. She could feel his smirk without seeing it. Camille took a deep breath, placed her fingers on the keys, and closed her eyes. Camille's fingertips hovered above the keys. The baby grand beneath her was pristine, polished, untouched, almost too clean. It didn't have the worn familiarity of her upright back home, where the middle C had a subtle wobble and the high notes carried a breathy hum. This piano was colder, more intimidating. A centerpiece meant to be looked at, not lived in. She inhaled. And then, with a soft exhale, she began. The first notes were tentative, like testing the surface of a lake before diving in. She played "River Flows in You," a contemporary piece she'd learned during long nights when the world outside felt too loud and music was her only refuge. Her fingers brushed gently across the ivory, each note soft but certain, like a whispered confession only the keys could understand. At first, the room didn't seem to register it. Conversations faded, but some forks still moved. A server passed behind her, unsure whether to pause or proceed. Then something shifted. Her left hand came in a subtle harmony that underlined the melody like a heartbeat, and suddenly, the air changed. A nearby couple put down their menus. A man at the bar swiveled on his stool. The clinking of glasses halted as if the music had stepped between the patrons and their indulgence and asked them, politely but firmly, to listen. Camille felt it. The room was holding its breath. So she leaned into it, not theatrically, but with purpose. Her hands moved faster now, the melody swelling, folding over itself like waves crashing on a shore. Every chord spoke of something unspoken. Sacrifices. Disappointment. The quiet strength it takes to keep showing up when the world keeps overlooking you. She wasn't just playing music. She was telling her story. The dining room of the Marigold Room, so often a place of power plays and overpriced wine, was momentarily transformed into a cathedral of silence and reverence. Even Brandon Locke, who had been lounging smugly with a fresh glass of scotch, was no longer smiling. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes narrowed not in scorn, but in something dangerously close to respect. Camille didn't see him. She didn't see anyone. She was somewhere else entirely. Back in her mother's living room. Back on the creaky bench in her tiny apartment. Back in all those moments where she questioned whether she was good enough. Whether it was foolish to dream so hard for something so intangible. Each measure released a piece of that doubt. The bridge arrived a cascade of arpeggios that shimmered like sunlight hitting water, and Camille let it fly. Her fingers danced. Her posture relaxed. She didn't care if she missed a note. She didn't care if her hands trembled. She was free. And the room? The room was frozen. Not a cough. Not a whisper. The entire restaurant had fallen under the spell of sound. Waiters stood still behind trays. A woman dabbed the corner of her eye with her napkin. Someone filmed on their phone, but even that gesture felt reverent, not intrusive. When the final note came, a soft resolution that lingered in the air like smoke, Camille lifted her hands and let them rest in her lap. Her chest rose and fell slowly. She didn't look up right away. She didn't have to. Because the silence was deafening. It stretched for one long, sacred moment. And then. Applause. It started small. A single clap. Then another. Then a wave of hands erupting into thunderous approval. People stood. Not all, but enough to send a message. A man in a navy blazer let out a low whistle. One of the bartenders banged a spoon against a shaker tin like a cymbal. The room was alive again, but changed. Softer. Warmer. Camille stood slowly, her knees unsteady but her spine straight. She turned, catching sight of her co-workers near the kitchen. Marcus nodded once, his arms folded and a slow grin tugging at his lips. Her manager stood at the host stand, eyes wide, as if trying to remember whether there had ever been a rule against impromptu concerts. Then her gaze found Brandon. He was still seated, still staring. But the arrogance in his posture was gone. He looked, cornered. Like a man who'd walked into a trap of his own making. His entourage shifted uncomfortably. No more chuckles. No more smug glances. Just silence. Brandon finally clapped. 2 slow, hollow strikes of his palms. A performance, but not for her. For himself. For the optics. He raised his glass slightly and muttered, "Didn't see that coming." Camille tilted her head, offered the faintest nod, and walked back toward her station. The moment didn't belong to Brandon Locke. It belonged to her. As she passed the tables she'd been serving all night, diners reached out to offer compliments. "You were incredible. Where did you learn to play like that? That was better than any concert I've paid for." Camille responded with soft thank yous, her voice modest but steady. She felt no triumph, only clarity. This wasn't about proving something to Brandon or anyone else. This was about remembering who she was. At her station, she picked up a pitcher of water and resumed her work. Her steps were lighter now. Her shoulders looser. It wasn't pride. It was relief. She had nothing left to prove. Behind her, the baby grand sat still, the echo of her performance woven into its strings. The applause eventually faded, but its echo lingered in the space like perfume in a closed room, present, undeniable, transformative. Camille poured water into glasses with the same care as before, but something in her rhythm had changed. She no longer shrank into the background. She no longer avoided eye contact. The patrons who had once seen her as just the waitress now looked at her with a different lens, one tinged with admiration and, in some cases, embarrassment that they hadn't seen her before. One older woman at a corner table clasped Camille's hand gently as she refilled her cup. "You don't belong in a uniform like that, sweetheart," she whispered. "That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years." Camille smiled softly. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot." From another table, a man in a tailored gray suit nodded as she passed. "You've got something rare," he said. "Don't let this place keep it locked inside." Camille appreciated the words, but didn't let them inflate her. Compliments weren't currency. They didn't erase the grind, the exhaustion, or the months of postponed piano lessons and overdue bills. But tonight, they meant something more. They were proof of impact. She glanced across the room. Brandon Locke was still there, though the energy around his table had thinned. The entourage that once surrounded him with laughter and empty flattery now sat in quiet discomfort. No more bold jokes. No more grand storytelling. Just a man with a Scotch glass and nothing impressive left to say. Camille approached with the checkbook tucked under her arm, her demeanor calm, composed. As she set the leather folder on the table, Brandon looked up at her, and for the first time all night, he didn't wear a smirk. "You've made your point," he said, his voice clipped but low enough not to draw attention. Camille met his eyes without hesitation. "It wasn't about making a point," she replied. "I just wanted to play." Brandon blinked. That wasn't the response he expected. He fumbled with the checkbook, scribbled his signature, and slid a few folded bills inside more than necessary, but not enough to feel like atonement. Just a gesture. A weak one. "I underestimated you," he muttered, as if that counted for something. Camille tilted her head slightly. "A lot of people do." She didn't say it with spite. She didn't have to. The grace in her tone was its own power, a reminder that dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't demand applause. It simply exists, and it holds. Brandon leaned back, swirling the last of his drink. His usual armor, his bravado, his control was crumbling around him. He looked smaller now, as if the spotlight had shifted and revealed not greatness, but hollowness. And everyone in the room could see it. As Camille turned to walk away, one of Brandon's companions, a younger man with a clean-cut look and a fidgety nervousness, stood up and called softly, "Miss Harris?" Camille stopped, surprised to hear her full name. He stepped toward her, extending his hand awkwardly. "That was, really something. Thank you. For sharing it." She shook his hand, a small but genuine smile on her face. "You're welcome." It was the first sincere interaction she'd had with anyone at that table. And somehow, it meant more than any tip. Back at the service station, Marcus waited with crossed arms and a half-grin. "You good?" Camille let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Yeah," she said. "I'm good." He nodded once. "That guy's gonna remember tonight for a long time." "Not because of the music," she replied with a dry chuckle. "No," Marcus said. "Because he lost." And everyone saw it. As the evening wound down, the Marigold Room returned to its usual rhythms. Orders came in. Plates went out. But something had changed. The staff moved differently around Camille, now more carefully, with a new level of respect. And the guests? They didn't look at her the same way either. Some stopped her to say thank you again. Others just smiled, that quiet kind of smile that says, "You surprised me." And I liked it. Near closing, Camille found herself wiping down the same table Brandon had occupied. The chair where he sat still held the imprint of the moment, the failed performance of power. She didn't feel bitterness. Only clarity. The night hadn't been about him. It had been about reclaiming something inside herself. When she finally clocked out, the tip pool had grown thicker than usual. Diners had been unusually generous, likely moved by what they'd witnessed. Camille counted enough to cover rent and still have some left over. Enough for that masterclass she'd been eyeing. Maybe even enough to fix the sticky pedal on her apartment's piano. Outside, the Charleston air was cool and salty. The historic district lights flickered gently, casting golden reflections on the quiet sidewalks. Camille walked home alone, her steps unhurried, her mind uncluttered for the first time in a long while. It wasn't about the applause. Or the compliments. Or even the money. It was about the choice. She had chosen to play. To take up space. To own her voice in a room that tried to shrink it. And in doing so, she'd reminded everyone including herself that talent doesn't need permission. It needs courage. The next morning, Camille woke up before her alarm, the Charleston sunlight filtering through gauzy curtains in her small but tidy apartment. Her body was sore from the long shift, but her mind was alert, humming with something she hadn't felt in years: clarity. Purpose. She rolled out of bed and wandered over to the old upright piano in the corner. It was a second-hand piece from a pawn shop on Meeting Street. A little off-key in the upper octaves. One leg shorter than the rest. But it was hers. She sat down and lifted the lid, running her fingers over the smooth, familiar surface. No audience. No expectations. Just her and the keys. She played the same piece from the night before, not for validation, but because it lived in her now. The music no longer felt like a secret part of her identity. It was her center. And last night, the world had finally caught a glimpse. After a light breakfast, Camille checked her phone for messages. One voicemail stood out. It was from an unfamiliar number with a Nashville area code. Her heart skipped. She played it. "Hi, Ms. Harris. My name is Julian Travers. I'm a music producer currently visiting Charleston. I was at the Marigold Room last night. Your performance was stunning. I'd love to talk with you about recording a demo if that's something you'd be open to. No pressure, but I think your sound deserves to be heard beyond a dining room. Call me back anytime." Camille stared at the phone, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and wonder. This wasn't some overnight stardom fantasy. Julian hadn't offered fame or fortune. Just a conversation. A step. A door creaking open on hinges she'd thought were rusted shut. She sat still for a while, letting the words settle. For years, she had let the weight of life, of practicality, of fear, keep her dreams boxed in. She'd told herself she was waiting for the right time, for circumstances to change. But last night proved that sometimes, all it takes is one moment of courage. One refusal to stay silent. She called him back. They spoke briefly, Julian's voice warm, respectful, and curious. He wasn't promising her a record deal, just an opportunity to explore. A chance to create something. It was enough. More than enough. That afternoon, she walked to her shift at the Marigold Room with her head high. Her co-workers greeted her with nods and half-jokes, calling her the star of the dining room. Camille chuckled and shrugged it off, but inside, she carried something precious: certainty. The same guests from the night before trickled in, and some recognized her. One man left her a note with his receipt: "Never stop playing." A teenage girl asked to take a photo with her, saying she'd been inspired to take her old keyboard out of the closet. Camille smiled with real joy. Not because she was finally seen, but because her music had moved someone. Even just one person. That made it worth every late shift, every rejection letter, every missed opportunity. As the evening rush picked up, she glanced once more at the baby grand in the corner. It gleamed under soft lighting, no longer just a decoration. It had become part of her story. Not a stage of humiliation. But a place of reclamation. A week later, she stood in a small studio on the outskirts of Nashville. Headphones on. Fingers poised over a full-sized keyboard. Julian nodded from behind the soundboard, giving her the go-ahead. She played. The first take was shaky. Her nerves tried to creep in. But then she remembered the dining room. The silence. The faces turned toward her, not in mockery, but in reverence. She closed her eyes and let the music guide her hands. She recorded 3 pieces that day. At the end of the session, Julian leaned into the mic and said, "You've got a sound that tells a story, Camille. Don't hide it." She wouldn't. Not anymore. In the weeks that followed, nothing exploded overnight. There were no viral videos. No record contracts in the mail. But something else began to grow: a small community of listeners, musicians, and mentors who heard her demo and reached out. Invitations to local showcases. Collaborations with other artists. A teaching opportunity at a community center. Each step felt earned. Grounded. Real. And through it all, Camille kept working at the Marigold Room. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. The job that once felt like a cage had become something else, a starting line. Brandon Locke, for his part, never returned. But Camille heard whispers that he had tried to recreate his spectacle at another venue only to be met with stone-faced silence. Word travels fast in small elite circles, and arrogance tends to curdle when exposed to real grace. Camille didn't dwell on it. His power had never been real, not over her. Not anymore. One night, long after the restaurant closed, Camille stayed behind. Marcus was mopping the kitchen while the last of the staff trickled out. She sat alone at the baby grand, the room dim and still. She played something new. Something hers. A melody that hadn't existed until that moment. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. But it was alive. And that, she realized, was the real miracle. Not the applause. Not the recognition. But the freedom to create. To speak. To be. She finished the piece and sat quietly in the afterglow. Then, with a smile, she closed the lid and whispered to the room, "That's only the beginning. Sometimes, the loudest kind of power is the quietest." Camille didn't argue. She didn't retaliate. She simply sat down at the piano and let her truth speak through every note. This story reminds us that your worth doesn't shrink just because someone fails to see it. True strength isn't always about confrontation, it's about knowing who you are, even when others try to make you feel small. You don't need applause to validate your talent. You don't need permission to be brilliant. The world is full of people like Brandon, loud, entitled, dismissive. But one moment of quiet courage can silence all of them. So ask yourself, what gift are you hiding because someone made you doubt it? What voice have you been quieting to make others comfortable? Maybe it's time to stop waiting for the right moment and create it instead. Thank you for watching this story. If it moved you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you of your own silent strength, hit the like button, drop a comment, and subscribe for more powerful true stories that celebrate dignity, resilience, and the quiet triumphs that change everything. Your story might be the next one we tell.